Hey YouTube, I'm Joe McGlenn. Welcome back to my workshop. I'm building a customized Studebaker pickup inspired by the Rod and Custom Dream Truck. It's chopped, it's sectioned, it's lowered, it has air ride suspension. I just recently finished the rear frame. I put a giant kick up in it, I narrowed the rear axle housing, I redesigned all of the suspension brackets for 4-link, panhard bar, tubular cross members. I'm really happy with that. Now I'm turning my attention to the cab and getting some of the mechanical systems fabricated that I need to be able to move on. There's lots and lots to do here. So between the firewall and the brake pedals and the hood hinges and a bunch of other moving parts, there's a lot of systems that all have to relate to each other and interact. So the firewall was cut out a long time ago when I sectioned the body. So I made a new firewall, but before I can really put it in, I need to know where the steering column intersects that firewall and how I'm going to support the steering column. I need to know where the brake pedal is going to go and how that's going to pass through the toe boards. So there's a lot of ways that people can approach this. You know, I do a lot of mock-ups with poster board, and I spend a lot of time daydreaming and thinking about it. Sometimes I draw things up on the computer. Yesterday, I had a bunch of ideas that were bouncing around my head, and I wanted to make sure that had everything organized. So this is just a mental map of the different things that I want to do in this next phase of work on the Studebaker. I'm over here somewhere thinking about the steering column. So I've already mocked up the steering column and connected the steering just loosely to make sure that I had the geometry in a place where it would work. And what I did to accomplish that is I tack welded in this 1x2 rectangular steel tube cross member. The original dash has been cut out, and the original bracing is long since gone. So I put this in, which will stiffen up the cab some. There'll be more bracing that I'll put in as I go. And right here, I made a clamshell mount by splitting a piece of 1x2x1/8 inch tubing, welding some tabs on here, and welding tabs on here that are tapped. So I can just put bolts through that, and this will clamp the steering column in place. I've had the steering column in with the firewall off, and I hooked up the steering, made sure that all worked okay, took it back out. Obviously, the steering column needs to pass through here somewhere. So how do we do that? That's a good question. I also need to figure out where the hole in the firewall needs to be, and I don't want to cut a giant hole and have a mess. So what I've done, first step, is I took a piece of PVC pipe and I clamped it here in my steering column mount, and I picked up the angle between the steering column and the firewall when it's installed. I used that angle once I had it dialed in and I was happy with the fit. I cut another piece of 2-inch by 1/8 inch wall tube at that same angle. And the reason I'm using this tube, this is the same tubing that I used to build the clamshell mount, is because it's a nice slit fit over the steering column. So my plan is that when I'm done, this piece of tubing will slide through the firewall with perhaps 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch protruding on the outside of the firewall. I'll have a reinforcing plate on the inside that will be welded to this tube, and that plate will be spot welded to the firewall. And at the inside edge here, I'm going to create a little split collar. I'll split the tubing on one side here and here, making a little T, and I'll have a little draw bolt that will clamp that together. So this will support the lower end of the steering column. The upper end of the steering column right under the dash is supported by that clamshell mount. So that will get the steering column figured out. I still have to rework the brake pedal. I'm not happy with the angle, and then figure out where that will come through the toe board. And I also have to set up some hood hinges. And this is a great example of how this stuff all ties together. The original hood hinges, I believe, just mounted to the side of the cab right behind the hood. They wouldn't fit and they're long gone. And I wanted something that looked nice that I could mount on the firewall or through the firewall. But obviously, there's going to be the weight of the hood and they have to be rigid. I want to be able to bolt them on and off, not have any places for air or water to get into the cab. So that took some thinking. I had a couple of different ideas that I played with. And in the end, I have some surface mount hinges that I'm going to make that will bolt to the face of the firewall, and I'll have bolt plates on the inside. And there's some tricks around this because the firewall is not flat from side to side. So let me pause here and I'll grab the camera and I'll show you how I've got the firewall mocked up, and I'll show you how I made the firewall, and then I'll move on and I'll start doing some more fabrication work and get the hole in the firewall made and make a supporting brace for the pass-through and make a clamping ring for the other end of this little piece of tube, and we'll just keep moving. So glad to have you here. Hope you're having fun. Thanks. All right, let's take a look at the firewall from the engine bay side. I made this out of 16 gauge sheet metal. It's all flat with a rolled edge. The way I rolled that edge was I made a chipboard pattern of the opening around the perimeter of the firewall, and another chipboard pattern of the opening that I wanted around the engine, and put those together, came up with my master pattern, and I used that to bandsaw out a couple pieces of MDF, stack them up. So I use the same form for the left and right sides. The corners are just rounded over with a router bit, and everybody probably knows this. The way this works is you just clamp up a sandwich. I put a couple of pins through it to keep things from shifting around, and you gently tap the metal over at the edge. So I did a pretty nice job. Not perfect. There'll be a little hammer and dolly work as I adjust the seam, but it's just mocked up at this point. And what I did is I laser cut these little clover leaf tabs out. I didn't invent this idea. I've seen other people do this, but super handy. You can buy these. These are ones I made. And I put 2 clecos here into the Studebaker cowl in the hood recess, and then 2 more right into the edge of this 16 gauge sheet metal piece that I formed for the firewall. And the advantage of that is it holds it exactly in position. I can take it off and put it back on, and every time it goes back on in exactly the same spot, as opposed to trying to use C-clamps or vice grips or, duct tape, whatever have you, to do that. So this lets me put it on and take it off and get it back in the same position accurately every time. And I had to do some adjusting as I went. In some places the flange wasn't straight or it was too wide. So I had to get this fit right here in the middle. I made both pieces overly long by a couple of inches and used a plumb bob to drop a line and cut a seam there. And then at the end I had to do a little file work to get a reasonable fit up between the 2 panels. And I have to do a little more fine tuning, but I think I'm pretty happy with that. So that's the firewall, and it's all mocked up. Obviously, I need to figure out where the steering's going to come through. While I'm here, you can see years ago I built this jack shaft that goes through the frame to be able to put the brake pedal more on the outside. So I didn't think I would have enough room to put the brake pedal right there with the engine that close. So I think that's still a good idea. If, as I look at this, I decide that that actually puts the brake pedal in a weird place, I may redo that. But for right now, I'm happy enough with that. So this shaft runs all the way through, and it's keyed. And I have a keyed piece that is part of the brake pedal. So it works really well. It's more about positioning. So if we come around to the inside of the cab, my job now is to figure out where the steering column intersects the firewall and make that lower mount that I was talking about. And then once that's done, I'll think about the brake pedal and where that comes through and how the ergonomics of that interfere with my feet. And then also the hood hinges. The hood hinges, I'm pretty excited about that. I came up with something that I think is pretty cool. We'll see how it works. So stay tuned for that. What I'm going to do now is all the fiddling around to mark a hole in the firewall, cut a nice neat hole, and start fitting pieces together so I can tack weld it, pull it off, weld it solid as necessary, and then put that piece of the firewall back on. So let's get on with that. Okay, everything is mocked up, ready for me to lay out the opening in the firewall. I've got the steering column clamped into the clamshell mount. It's pulled way back, of course. Normally this will stick, 8, 10, 12 inches into the engine compartment. I have the 2-inch tube with the angle cut flush against the inside edge of the firewall. I put layout fluid here on the firewall surface. I'm going to use a a scribe, scribe a nice clean line around this, and then I'll tear this all down. I'll make a hole with a rotor broach, use a carbide burr to get a nice clean cut, and right up to my line, and that's that. Okay, so I've got the firewall, driver's side firewall piece back off. You can see the turned edge here. Needs a little tune-up still, but I think it's going to work out really well. So my plan is I'll center punch this to mark where I want the center of the hole to be. And because this shaft intersects it at an angle, this is actually an oval, not a circle. And I don't have any oval hole saws. So what I'm going to do is drill a pilot hole and then use a smaller rotor broach to drill a hole and leave plenty of material between the hole and the scribed line. And then I'll use a die grinder with a carbide burr to sneak right up to my line, get the best fit I can. Once I've done that, I have a small piece of 1/8" plate that I've also scribed the same shape onto. I will do this on the drill press. I'll drill the hole, use the die grinder to sneak up to my line, and then I will scribe using the hole that I cut as a guide and scribe an outside perimeter, so I have a 3/8" ring that will go around the tube where it passes through the firewall to provide a little extra reinforcement to the firewall right in that spot. So I'll put on some safety gear and get these parts made.
So after making all the parts, I've got a nice clean hole through the firewall. Tube slips through very nicely. I've got a little reinforcing ring that will get welded in, and we're ready to move on to making the split collar. So there's two machine operations to make the clamping mechanism here. I'm set up on the mill here, and I'm cutting a lengthwise slot using a slitting cutter. The slot is about 1 inch long, and I'm just carefully slotting along. I've got a stop mark scribed on the tube. And then I change over to a vertical setup, and I make a bisecting cut that extends about 1/2 inch on each side of the lengthwise slot. And these are just relief cuts so that that part of the tube will be able to flex easily and clamp snugly around the steering column. The next thing to do is to make a small threaded boss and a through-drilled boss out of 3/4 inch round tubing. So I'm set up on the lathe, and I face off the part, center drill it. I drill it with the tap drill for a 5/16 18, and then I actually tap it on the lathe, and I run the lathe in back gear to do this, and I just cycle it forward and backward as if I was tapping it by hand, but it's fairly fast and works pretty well. The final step is just to part it off, and we're ready to move on.
All right, here's the part that we slit. This is going to be the inside of the steering column support, inside the firewall, and it'll be oriented like this, so the clamp is up on the top where it won't be seen. And here are the two little parts we made, just bolted together. This one's drilled through, this one's drilled and tapped. So I'm happy with that. My plan is to sand a small radius indent into that. Luckily, that top wheel is exactly the same size as my tube. So as long as I stay centered on that, I can sand in. I don't need to do a lot. I just want it so that this sits down a little bit and will sort of stay in position when I weld it.
So no rocket science here, just doing a little sanding. It's important to wear gloves with the belt sander. That belt does not know the difference between steel and skin. Ask me how I know.
All right, I've got all my little parts mocked up here. I put a washer in between, and the washer is indexed in the slot. So it's holding everything square, and it's also holding the two little machined parts spaced apart so that they can actually do their job and draw this together. The other thing to point out is I've just recently set myself up with this TIG button from 6061.com. Still learning how to use it, but it is a pressure sensitive switch to replace the foot pedal. And my hope is that once I get the hang of it, I'll be able to use this for out of position welding under the truck, or under the dash of the truck or something like that. So I think I'm ready to stop talking and start welding. So let me get to that.
So I'm very much still getting used to this TIG button. I was able to get the part welded, but it's not my best weld, let's say. So I have high hopes for it, though. It's definitely a solid piece of gear, and I just need to make the transition to go from using my foot pedal, where I have a broad range of motion to control the power, to the button, which doesn't really have any discernible range of motion. It's just pressure. So it's a learning experience, but I think this is going to work really well.
Okay, I think that's a wrap. I wouldn't say that's my best weld ever. I'm still learning how to control the torch with the TIG button. It's different than the foot pedal, which is what I'm used to. But it is welded. It's nice and solid. The parts are lined up. When I tighten the bolt, this little split will draw together, and it will grab the bottom of the steering column and hold it super securely. So the only thing left on this project is to fit it back to the truck, slide it through the firewall, put the little oval ring on it, the reinforcing ring, and get that in the right spot. I'll tack weld it, then I'll bring it back to the bench and do some more practicing with the TIG button, weld that up. So I think that's where I'm going to stop for today. Next time, we're going to start digging into the hood hinges, I think. So that should be fun, because I came up with a pretty cool design, I think. See you then.